Alrighty, so I've got a meta update for you. We've got a couple really big tournaments coming up. We have a sector in Richmond in a couple days. A week after that, we've got the regional in Lille. So huge tournaments, and due to the suspensions that happened to Django, DJ, and Triple Dark Raid, we're also going to have a whole new metagame to discover. We're going to see new decks. Hopefully, we're going to see some old ones try to maintain their place in the field. And what I'm going to do in this video is kind of cover what I am predicting or seeing so far in trends, and then talk to you a bit about strategy and what the decks that I expect to be present are trying to do so that you can better prepare for these tournaments. Before I get going, please hit that subscribe button if you haven't. It helps out a ton. And check out my Patreon if you haven't. I've got a lot of decks up there and some other things going on as well, so do check it out. All right, so what is this video going to do? Well, first of all, I'm going to discuss what I think will be the meta, right? We're going to have a lot of decks showing up. I'm not going to do deck list breakdowns. That's not what this is for. I'm going to be talking about archetypes and what the decks that I expect to be at these tournaments will be trying to do to win. And I'm going to cover them in different groups. And the groups I've done are based on kind of two things. One is how good I think the decks are, and then the other is how popular I think they will be. I've tried to create some kind of like mush between those two things. I wouldn't worry too much about like the tiers later down. It's really just three groups that I'm talking about in terms of like where I see them solidifying in this meta. And yeah, I'm going to talk about all these decks, and let's just jump right into it. So group one here for me is Quinlan Tarkentown, Sabine ECL, Han Green, and Anakin Colossus. So we're going to start with Quinlan, who I think a lot of people, I don't know what everyone thinks, but I think that a lot of people think this is maybe the best deck, or certainly like one of the best decks, and that it will kind of maintain its presence based on what its presence was before Django got banned, right? So Quinlan was already kind of a top tier deck, and it's one of the few top tier decks that really had no impact to it, right? Because Han got impacted and Django got impacted. I mean, Django's gone completely, and Quinlan didn't. So he's still around. Now, my hot take, I don't know, maybe it's not hot take, I think it is though, is that Quinlan's actually not a particularly well-positioned deck right now. I don't think, it's certainly not something I would play at a tournament coming up. And this is coming from someone who took this deck to the Denver sector, finished 12th place with it, the 9-2 record. I thought it was fantastic. I think it just has a bit of an issue right now. And the issue is Quinlan is not really built to be the best deck in the format. It is not built in such a way that it can survive, in my opinion, having a giant target on it. A lot of decks right now present very different challenges for Quinlan, and he is getting spread very thin. Down even to deck selection, like Quinlan's had deck selection issues all the way down to like its turn 1 plays. What 2-drops does it play, right? Does it play 6 shielded units to get rid around like Django's pings? Does it want the ambush unit? Does it want any space turn 1 plays or go straight to the ground? Does it want a force unit on turn 1? And all of these things are good into different decks, and when they are all good into different decks, and then you have to play all those different decks all the time, then you end up in situations where your build is only good into some things. And when the meta was much more solidified into like what was best, Django clearly number 1, Han clearly number 2, you didn't have to account for nearly as many things. But now I think you do, and Quinlan is a very fair deck. Quinlan is never going to be a deck that gets crushed by anything. Like, I think that's a very appealing part about Quinlan, is that its matchup spread is going to be somewhere in the middle no matter what. But right now, if you look even just on this screen, I think it's unfavored into Sabine and Han on this screen. It is likely favored into Anakin, especially if they play Colossus because of the hand disruption element of Quinlan. But if we're going to jump to the next screen too in a bit, and I think Quinlan's unfortunately kind of unfavored into all the decks on that screen too. Not by much. It's like at worst probably like a 45%er. I'm making that number up entirely, but all the time when we say like a matchup is 40-60 or 50-50, we are just basically making up numbers. So that's what I'm doing, but it's about I would say like it doesn't really get much worse for Quinlan than a 45%er. But so the floor is very high for this deck. I just think the ceiling's a little capped right now with how many decks it's like slightly a dog too. Like if I'm playing the 50-50 deck, I want it to actually be 50-50, and right now I feel Quinlan's not actually 50-50. But I do certainly expect a ton of it. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the most played deck in Richmond. I wouldn't be surprised if it made top 8. I think it's still a powerful deck. I think there's going to be a lot of people playing it. I think there's a lot of people that are very good at playing it. So, no, would not be shocked. It's just, personally, it's not where my head would be right now. Sabine ECL, though, is a deck that I think is quite powerful, and I think it's better positioned now than it's been a lot of times, and a lot is for the same reason that Quinlan might not be that well positioned. It's when people have to account for so many decks, the anti-Sabine stuff kind of has to come down, and the moment you start teching a little less into aggro, that's when aggro starts to come up, right? And Sabine's going to present, we kind of know the puzzle of Sabine, right? It's like turn 1 into a turn 2 potential wing leader, and now they have Chewie. So that's like one thing that can kind of spike you. Of course, there's like Fleet Lieutenant. Then we have to worry about the Sabine flip turn, where like, can you manage the Darksaber? And then you have to manage the ECL crazy stuff with Poe and Wrecker. And some decks are quite good at managing that end game thing. If they don't spend too much time on the ground, then the Poe and Wrecker are not as much of a problem. So as long as they can race Sabine in through the amount of damage Sabine can do on the ground, then they're okay. But I think Sabine is pretty well positioned right now. It's always been just a strong deck. It's just, it can be targeted. It's just when there's so much stuff going on around and more decks become viable, then it becomes more difficult to target Sabine specifically. And I did want to mention one more thing about Quinlan in terms of like things that you need to be concerned about. And the main thing is always the discard package. And there's two halves to it. There's the Spark Kira half, which is targeted hand disruption. And then there's the Force Throw Ahsoka half, which is like you get to pick. And you play around it all very differently, right? With the targeted discard, you want redundancy in your hand. With the Force Throw, you want cheap cards or the ability to interact with your opponent's force units. And then with Ahsoka, you want events. And you need, whenever you're playing against Quinlan with kind of any deck, you need to figure out which part of that discard package would hurt you the most and worry about playing around it as best as possible. Other than that Tarkin Town mini game is something that I think we've grown accustomed to with all the other Tarkin Town decks. And Quinlan's mini game is a little easier to kind of dodge because of how specific his ability is. But that's another thing that you, of course, need to account for. All right, Han Green. So Han Green has existed, but mostly in the shadow of Han Yellow. And there is a lot of power to the Han leader in general, right? Han is still probably the best flat-out leader effect in the game, being able to ramp, so just innately. And he has the ability to play overstatted turn 1 plays. And right now, the best thing to do with that is to play them in space and then potentially blow your opponent out with pilots, or just race them in the sky. And you can play tons of turn 1 powerful space units in this deck. Falcons, both of them, Blue Leader, Hullers, whatever else it may be. And then you can pilot them in a lot of cases. There's good pilots in these colors: Chewie, Han, Luke, Poe, etc. So that's like one element to this deck. Space aggro. The other element to this deck, of course, is this leader can play a 7-drop on turn 3 if it resupplies on turn 1 or 2. And that means U-Wing, and U-Wing can go fetch things like Han and Enfys, or it can go fetch just go wide stuff like the Falcons and Kira's or Chewbacca and put them on the ground. So 2 halves to 1 deck. Some people go a little harder on the U-Wing half and play even out of aspect cards. I think right now the more standard build is the more heavy pilot version that presents tons and tons of damage in space, and then can, of course, still do the kind of broken Han stuff that we've grown accustomed to. And I'd say the most difficult thing about interacting with this deck is the fact that it's very difficult to start again in space against them, because their turn 1 Falcon, especially the fast Falcon that can attack on turn 1, can hose any turn 1 start of that you might put in space. And that is kind of unrecoverable for a lot of decks, which means you usually have to start on the ground against Han. And then it becomes a little more difficult to interact with their space because their space is big, and then they can put pilots on it. So very tricky deck to maneuver, and certainly one that I expect will be pretty present. I don't know if it'll be as present as something like Quinlan or Sabine, but it's going to be around and something I would recommend practicing against. And the last one I've put in group 1, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I would put the 4th deck here. I was thinking about putting Anakin in group 2, but I think what puts him here is not so much me thinking he's great. It's more that I just expect him to get played a lot, and maybe I'm off base on that, but it's still a powerful deck. I don't think you necessarily have to play this with Colossus. I think 30 health is also viable. I think 30, in fact, would just make the deck better into Quinlan than it is right now. I think a major reason Anakin can suffer a bit into Quinlan is because of the lower hand size that it starts with. But this deck is a blue-red kind of mid-rangey controlling hero deck that also just has like a game ender in the leader. And it's a very interesting element to like hero mid-range, because most of the other hero mid-range decks need to just like keep going after their leader and like really reach that end game. And Anakin creates like a sub game where like he can sometimes just end the game over 2 turns on his own. And then if he doesn't, and your opponent had to put a bunch of energy into him, then he basically just turns into any of the other blue mid-range hero decks where they're just playing things like Luke and Redemption and other big stuff, right? And going that direction. Anakin can interact pretty well through all early phases of the game because he can do powerful trade-ups, so it's something you always need to watch out for. Just don't feed him units that otherwise wouldn't kill. You always need to, that otherwise wouldn't be able to kill you. You also need to manage his life total and think about the math and the breakpoints that way, right? If your opponent's at 19 and you have a 6 power unit, right? If you hit for 6, you've actually buffed Anakin 2 power, right? Is that going to matter in some way? And a lot of decks need to kill Anakin before they can kill their opponent, because Anakin will actually just kill them quicker. And Quinlan is one of them sometimes that like can't actually race Anakin, especially through 35 health. They need to find a way to interact with Anakin. And a lot of other decks need to as well. Even if they are aggro decks that are racing, they still can't just afford to take 11 twice from Anakin. Yeah, other than that, it plays a lot of removal. It plays like the good force units, usually a decent amount of restore built into this deck too. It just wants to stall out and help Anakin can either win the game on its own or bridge you to the very powerful top end that Hero Blue has, namely Luke Skywalker. But I don't think this deck does anything grossly unfair. It has a light discard package as well, especially post board. It can play it. It's not nearly as powerful as Quinlan's discard package. And there are other flavors of this deck too, like Rey can be played in a similar deck, right? Even Han to blue. Anakin has just been the one that's been basically the most durable because it presents a different challenge to the opponent than all the other ones, right? Because of how powerful and impactful the leader is when he flips. One of the few 6-cost leaders that actually I think is worth the cost of 6, because most of them are just like 4/7s that don't do anything particularly interesting. And Anakin, he can be enormous, like a 10/7, and he has Overwhelm, right? Remember that Overwhelm. Just remember that Overwhelm. All right, group 2. What do we got here? We got Kira, a bunch of different versions, right? I put the Command Center, the 30 health, I put ECL, Data Vault, but Kira is, depending on what version of this you're going to play, a mid-rangey control deck. ECL, more mid-range, where you're sacrificing a lot of deck space for like units to work with that, like Long Pike, potentially like things like Gideon, Fire Spray if you need more space ambushers. Of course, Devastating Gunship, although that one is usually in all the versions. And then all the way to Data Vault is usually one that's playing much more for the late game. You might see more super laser blasts in a version like that. And, they're not going to ramp as frequently because there's 60 cards in the deck, but they're going to stall better into that late game. Command Center, somewhere in between, usually plays a little more mid-rangey like ECL, but of course has more deck space without the ECL targets. You want to always manage her flip turn. You want to figure out how you're going to interact with Kira's flip turn. Often you don't want to just like jam your leader out if they haven't flipped yet. You want to encourage them to do it to some other units. If you have ways to deal 1 damage or 2 damage, you want to maybe force her to trade into like a 3 power unit. One example, I talk about Quinlan a lot, but that's because he's very popular. If you can force Kira to attack into your like 3 power Ahsoka, then next turn you can Plo Koon and just ping her and she dies and you don't have to use your Plo Koon. But if Kira is a 6/2, then all of a sudden that Plo Koon can't do that, right? So these little intricacies. Cad Bane has ways, right? If Kira flips on an empty board, McClunky can kill her, right? Or if you might need to use your Lone Pike, or force her to kill a Boba Fett and then play any Underworld unit or like an IG-2000 to finish her off, right? Different decks have different ways to manage this flip turn, but it's a very powerful effect, and she uses that flip turn into a bridge turn so that she can get to like the 7s. Once the Vaders and Mauls come down, it becomes very difficult to catch back up if you haven't pushed enough damage or established enough of a board. But Kira is probably my vote for the 50-50 deck right now. I think probably a little better positioned than Quinlan, if I'm being honest. But yeah, she is not a kind of deck that smashes anything or a kind of deck that really auto loses to much. And I think has a very good hard control matchup, like an almost unlosable one post board with Relentlesses and Palp's returns. I think once you kind of practice that matchup and know what it is that actually matters against hard control, it's not even just a Kira specific thing. It's just like a green villain thing. Especially when you're playing Ramp and Vaders, it becomes very clean. And we got Emperor Palpatine on this list too, and I think he's going to grow in popularity. Now, he's as awful as ever into Sabine, but he is just a bigger version of this Kira deck. You get a much more impactful leader. You get to play 35 health with Palpatine, who does mitigate the downside a little better because he's got built-in card draw into his leader ability. And yeah, just like the ultimate big guy deck, it's not really a hard control deck like something like Bosk, which we'll talk about in a second, but it is a control deck for sure, and it just wants to grind out value with its card draw as much as possible. Palpatine will use that ability a ton. A very good strategy for fighting Palpatine is actually just kill all his units. Just because you are an aggro deck doesn't mean you can't interact with him at all. You do not need to just slam everything into base. Sabine will mostly just do that, but other decks, you can very much just try to interact with his draw engine, keep his board as clean as possible, make his flip turn as awkward as possible, and you'll have a better time. All right, we put Cad Bane on this list in 2 versions, Green and Tarkin Town. Green is a more mid-rangey. It's going to play Maul, which is probably the biggest get for Green besides ramping. And Tarkin Town version is almost a mono yellow deck, but you get Tarkin Town and you get IG-2000. And IG-2000 is absolutely fantastic in Cad Bane. And this is a pretty, interesting enough, this deck can grind better than it looks like. It has, in my opinion, a good matchup into Quinlan, which is pretty important. Has a decent matchup into Anakin. And I think it fights Han Green better than Quinlan does. So, they kind of occupy a similar space, although I think Quinlan has a much better matchup into something like a Bosk Blue deck. I think they have basically similar matchups into the blue-green villain decks like Kira. I think Kira is favored into both of them, but not by much, and I think they both are pretty similar in there. So, but their matchup spreads aren't that wild, and their overall gameplay is similar because of the Tarkin Town early game stuff. Cad Bane has better space, in my opinion, and better ways to interact with space because it's got the 2/4 Sentinel. Its pings are more reliable, and it's got more cross arena interaction with McClunky and Relentless Pursuit. And these are the kinds of things you want to remember. You always need to think about breakpoints with Cad Bane, how his ambush units interact with your board, like Forlom and Bosk, or if they're playing green. They might even have more ambush units like Syndicate, Lackeys, and Maul. So how the McClunky interacts with your board. You also have to think about Bazine. It's one deck that you should not be surprised if they turn one Bazine you, and like you need to make sure that doesn't just like make you skip a turn, right? Ramp decks in particular, keep 2 ramp if you're in your hand if you have it, because it really hurts when they take it. So Cad Bane, I think, also a decently positioned deck. It does not have like clean matchups across the board, but it has a lot of powerful stuff going on in both versions. And then the last one for this section is Bosk Blue. Hard control, right? This deck will probably evolve as it needs to, as it determines what is around more. The thing I always want to focus on when dealing with Bosk is Deathmark. I think that's, for most decks, the biggest issue, is you don't want them to draw 4 cards off of a Deathmark. Top target, not nearly as much of an issue for most decks, because these games will usually go kind of long no matter what, and you just need to grind out the Bosk from cards. And it's not actually that difficult to do, to like win a long game into this if you know kind of how to maneuver most of the decks. And one thing I will say about Bosk, a reason that I'm not a huge fan of playing a strategy like this, is because there's tons of silver bullets for this deck. So hero, especially something like Quinlan. Okay, mass hand disruption hurts this deck a ton. So does upgrade disruption, right? If you like bounty Deathmark and they Fang Fighter it or something, can really blow you out. What else? Villain green decks with their Palp Return Relentless strategy, as long as they kind of figured out the plan, it's an awful matchup for Bosk post board. It's like really bad. Hard aggro can get you too. I mean, I don't think Bosk is necessarily bad into Sabine, but it can be tricky, right? So and also there's just so much that decks can bring in post board against you to make them better into your deck, not so much the other way around. There are just a lot of ways to target this, but it somehow seems to always survive in the background and kind of like spike an event here and there. I'm not sure it's going to be the right kind of call this early in a tournament, because the meta is pretty wide. It's a little more difficult for a Bosk Blue deck to target everything it needs to target, right? When you knew Django was going to be 75% of the top cut, you just made your deck beat Django, right? And that's like, and then if you could like maneuver through the field, then you knew eventually you would just kind of play Django's over and over again. But it's not really something I think is happening right now. So when you're playing this deck, you manage the bounties best you can. You often want to trade off your units so that they can't get a double trigger, especially on the Deathmark. And you do want to kind of clear their units and clear that Bosk. Like, not a lot of decks should be ignoring all the units here. And I think this is a kind of tip in general with fighting control decks. It's not even just about Bosk. Just because you're the aggro in the control matchup doesn't mean all you do is go face. Bosk is a deck you can definitely grind out. You don't have to beat them by turn 6 or lose, right? There's a lot of decks that, even though they are more aggressive, can certainly win a game on turn 13 against Bosk, as long as they've grinded the Bosk out of cards and like forced Bosk to use its resources. All right, Group 3, Part 1. We're not going to spend as much time here because these decks at this point I think are not going to be huge like percentages in the meta, but we got Piet, blue or red most likely. They play big ships ahead of curve. What can go wrong? You want to try to not let them ramp if you can, even if it means like balancing a super laser tech. And then things like Waylay are very good into their big ships, because sometimes that's the only way they can ever stabilize. And then pivoting to ground, if Piet ever does stabilize in space, can also be pretty effective. But again, don't be scared of killing their units. It means they can't barrage. It means they can't turbo laser. Try to kill the Piet too if possible. Like Quinlan can one-shot him with Plo Koon. There's like basically nothing Piet can ever do about that. And yeah, other decks you might need to get him off the board too, because if it means one extra turn before they play like the 10-drop Devastator, maybe that's all that matters. Gar Saxon, I think you'll see a decent amount of this. Not a ton, but you know, it's basically a hard aggro deck that has difficult to interact with units. The problem with Gar is that it can get raced by other aggro decks like Sabine or Han. So it needs to interact in some ways, and it can play No Good to Me Dead. It can play Waylay, but its unit, the main gimmick here is that the units are difficult to interact with because they basically all have shields. That's like kind of the whole thing about Gar-Saxon is you play every shielded unit ever, and they all have +1 power, and you go face with them. And that is the general gist here. Just remember breakpoints with them. Remember how many pumps. It's going to be a lot of blasters. It's going to be things like snapshot reflexes. It's going to be surprise strikes, maybe even other pumps. And probably their scariest opener could be Krennic into Krennic's shuttle. That's a very difficult one sometimes. Or Krennic into Greedo into Krennic's shuttle. That's also very good. Han Yellow. I don't think this deck is completely dead. In fact, in a lot of matchups where DJ was not like the strategy, right? Like Han Yellow into Sabine, that's virtually an unchanged matchup, and Han Yellow should still be very favored in that matchup. But, you know, the reason this archetype is going to be less popular is because, well, DJ against a lot of decks was plan A, and he can't do this anymore, so it's basically just an aggro cunning deck now. It's still a good aggro cunning deck. I expect it to win a decent amount. I think it probably needs to be built less into the value town versions and more into the hard aggro versions to really succeed. But Han is just a very good leader, and I don't think this guy's going away completely. And then I got Luke Green on this list. This is a very grindy mid-range deck. It still plays a very powerful blue-green hero top end with Lukes and home ones, redemptions, can play Obies, right? Like, it's tons of value up there. It needs to find a way to get to that spot. So that's where like Shielded Sentinels come in, right? And you need to figure out ways to not get completely bricked by them playing like Village Protectors on turn 3 and then shielding it, and now it's got 2 shields, and like it just takes forever, and then they stall so much, right? You need to figure out where to interact with their units. Bounce is quite good into a lot of their stuff. Saboteur, of course, if you have any of it. And then establishing an early board so that it's more difficult for Luke to actually shield any of its units. It plays very much on curve or like one off curve. It's kind of a 1 unit a turn kind of deck, especially until like that mid to late game. So it's sometimes not too difficult to interact with it as long as you've established board control into it. And also definitely watch out for that turn 1 Alliance Dispatcher. All right, in this group 3 part 2, I've put a few more. We got Boba Burn with yellow. I think this deck is very fun. I did a video on it with when Triple Dark Raid was still around. I think this deck will get played more than it should, honestly. I don't think this deck is great anymore. Like, it's fine. It's just, I think there's just better ways to aggro your opponent right now. It lost so much of its power spike with Triple Dark Raid out, and even when Triple Dark Raid was there, it still sometimes had difficulty because it's a 6 deploy leader. It's also very susceptible to like bamboozle, and of course, if your opponent is removing your space units and things like that. When playing against this, I would recommend just practicing the matchup a little bit just so you get an idea of like how you should be deploying your indirect damage, so that you don't like get got by things, right? They play IG 2000 sometimes, so you don't always want to put everything down to 1. You have to remember they play things like Daring Raid. You have to understand how much you can get blown out on the Boba flip turn if that 4 damage can like wipe your board. But overall, a lot of decks can race this or control it. I don't think it's an incredibly well-positioned deck, but of all the decks actually in this group 3 that I've talked about, I think it might be the most played one because it just seems to be pretty popular. So if it's around, you got to prep for it. Rey Tarkintown. This is a similar idea to the Anakin deck. This Rey relies more on like prolonging the game with her ability than it is with Anakin, who's just trying to kill you very fast. Her ability is quite powerful. It does let you play some units that you probably would otherwise not play. And if Rey gets the stick on board with any sort of protection, it's very difficult to actually race her because of the 3 restore. So you play around these decks, and even like you can even throw like the Luke Green into this pile, and like they're still like hero mid-range decks. They all have like their own flavor, but a lot of the time they still all play similarly in the sense that they're just like kind of curve out decks. They usually play like one thing a turn. They try to like bridge with a lot of restore into a powerful leader flip. The way they do it is a little different, but it's the general archetype there. And Rey, like Anakin, can play a pretty powerful hand disruption element to it. Threw Vader up on here. Not even sure what color, but Space Swarm, right? It could happen. You might pair up against a Vader and like you need to not get completely overrun, right? If you don't have a turn 1 space unit, it means their token train will most likely start. So you need, and then it's very hard to get it to stop once it starts. So how do you reach across arena, or how do you race them on the ground, right? And that's things you need to think about when you're playing. And like, I don't expect Vader to be very popular. It's not, I wouldn't be like playing tons of like board clear specifically for token swarm, but I would at least have an idea of what my game plan would be when playing against the Vader swarm deck. And then I threw Yoda Data Vault on this deck because, you know, this is going to be very similar to the Luke deck. It's just going to be slower, and there'll probably be a card called Endless Legions in it. So don't put them at 5 remaining health so that the Endless Legion isn't free. And then just worry about things like You're My Only Hope fetching out early Obies or Lukes and stuff like that. But overall, I think it's not as good a deck as the Luke version. You're just playing a more expensive leader that doesn't do nearly as much in the early game unless you draw exactly 1 card. So not like, I think the prep for it won't be that much different than playing against Luke, except you have to remember the Endless Legion thing. All right, and my final call for group 3, and this is, you know, you could throw like 10 more leaders up here. I just wanted to like, yeah, Kazuda, like you might see it, or Von Rag or something like that, like the Hyper Aggro Pilot. So have an idea of how you're going to interact with that. Poe might be around as like a Sabine alternative, although he can be played in yellow, blue, or ECL, right? So you see other versions. You can see Han, young Han in yellow. You can see him in ECL as well, and he sometimes plays a little more of a swarming red-green ECL version because he can play like multiple units on turn 1 because of his ability. And the last one I threw on this list is Darth Vader, and I think this is only on this list because of the showcase equity, so I just expect some people will be showcase hunting, so you might bump into a Vader. It might be a blue version, which would be like a boss control deck, just slightly worse, or it might be like a green version, and it would be like a mid-range red-green Vader deck. And, you know, I don't think he's amazing, but if people are playing it to chase for a showcase, you might bump into it. All right, that's what I got for you. Let me know what you think of this recap. Let me know if there's any other decks that you think might be popular. Give me your predictions for what might surprise or might just fail to surprise. And yeah, love to hear it. And until next time, take care.